looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Well, we did the organised killer, so now it's time for the disorganised killer in part 2 of our little sojourn through the marvellous mental landscape of the immorally scrupulous murderer. If you haven't seen part 1, then please do so, but if you have, then we're going to crack straight on with part 2 because we have a lot to cover. Okay, so for today's video, we're covering the rather unhinged and sadistic trio of unknowns who are known as the Strangers. Now, I did a video a while back about their antisocial tendencies, but as that's not the main issue for today, I will cheerfully direct you back to that video in terms of some more depth and study over their conduct disorder and antisocial personalities. However, as we have covered the forensically detailed and obsessive-compulsive mindset of the organised killer, it's only right that we check out the yin to that particular yang and scrutinise some ponderings of the disorganised killer. Now, we have seen how Dollarhide studied and meticulously planned his killing sprees as an organised killer and, despite having a severe mental illness, latent vulnerability and unresolved trauma, he managed to slaughter 2 families in the most horrific of ways. However, when it comes to the disorganised killer, we're looking at something completely different. In 1980, Hazelwood and Douglas stated that the disorganised killer was a lust murderer who typically conducted unplanned crimes where the victim is not specifically targeted. The offender is unlikely to engage in conversation with the victim, and sexual acts are occasionally performed on the body after death. The body is not removed from the crime scene, and there are also clues such as blood, semen and fingerprints all deliberately left. This type of offender tends to be of low intelligence, socially awkward and unlikely to have a sexual partner. They are likely to have poor employment history and very little interest in their crimes. And this is fascinating because it encapsulates the Strangers perfectly in terms of a nutshell description of their crimes. Okay, so there's no sexual violence as they don't rape anyone, but in both movies they leave their crime scenes in an absolute mess of aggrandised carnage with zero attempts at hiding their bloodletting. Okay, as they all die in part 2, it's hard to leave a crime scene untouched when you're dead, but had Dollface and co not met their maker, they would have walked away from that holiday park and left it as a complete and utter bloodbath. After all, they merrily torture and then disfigure the elderly couple at the start of the film, and when they're found later by Bailey Madison and her brother with flies buzzing around their severely mutilated corpses, the scene has been left without one jot of effort to clean up the bodies. Okay, let's make one thing clear here. When we say disorganised and not planned, this doesn't mean that someone just leaps out of a car and just hacks someone to death. Very few people turn on a whim and just kill someone, as the act takes thought, is considered, and or the victim may have been followed or stalked for a short time. Some victims do just appear, the proverbial girl walking down a dark alleyway alone being one such incident, but the disorganised word means that once the victim is found, like Liv Tyler and her boyfriend in the first movie and Christina Hendricks' family in the second, the murder is committed without planning, the scene is just abandoned, and the attack has been quite spontaneous. In the first movie, we briefly see the Stranger's truck when Liv Tyler and her boyfriend stop for a smoke and a sulk. The suggestion is that these kids, and we know they're young when they remove their masks at the end of the film for the initiation of Stabby McStabstab, have been driving around and decided that these 2 poor souls will be their target. There's no planning as such, just see someone you quite fancy and torture them and see where the night takes you from there. Now, there is little evidence to suggest that Liv Tyler and her boyfriend have been meticulously selected, and they are really just the focus of an opportunity. Disorganised killers usually surprise their victims and kill them at or near the scene where they first strike. And this is true in both Strangers movies, as Liv Tyler and her boyfriend are killed in the cabin, and in the sequel, Hendrik's husband and the kids are stalked around the holiday caravan park that they are visiting. All their victims are usually killed quickly and in an uncontrolled manner, which means lots of stabbing or brutal violence, and although disorganised killers generally do not bind or control their victims, Liv Tyler and her boyfriend are bound at the end of the film, but this appears to be so they are held tight for the initiation ceremony of Stabby McStabstab, where the strangers decide they're going to take their first victims properly and slowly stab them to death. The elderly couple are bound in the sequel, but again, this appears to enable the strangers to do some truly heinous things like rip their jaws off, but neither Hendrix, her husband, or the son, who does eventually survive in the stranger's prey at night, are bound and tortured and are simply slayed where they stand, sit, or swim. The strangers then make no attempt to conceal the bodies or to hide or remove any evidence, and you can't imagine that Sackface and co really follow the outcome in the news, as they are merely mentally disturbed individuals who are finding themselves through sadism. The disorganised killer has poor social skills, and this is clear in the strangers as they remain mute and, at the end of the film, speak briefly and in monotone to suggest that this killing gig they're now into will get easier the second time round. They don't appear to be sexually connected, with no physicality or affection being shown between them. The poor hygiene of Sackface is suggested in the sequel, as his suit is filthy and, as discussed in my previous video, their intelligence is likely to be low and their personalities leaning towards the antisocial side, or certainly that of severe conduct disorder as well as psychopathy. So, if Dollarhide, our organised killer, was abused and had latent vulnerability and also an obsessive-compulsive personality, what would these three delinquents have inside their skulls in terms of brain structure? Well, let's pop the hood and have a look at what makes up Sackface, Dollface and Pinup's brains. First things first, as I stated at the start, it's crucial that we state that the strangers have antisocial personality disorders. Now, we talked about control and focus and the ability to blend into society with Dollarhide in part 1, but when we come to the disorganised killer, we're on a different personality continuum. In other words, whilst the obsessive-compulsive personality is formed in introversion and focus to detail, the antisocial personality, which our strangers have, is formed through extroversion, and the main regulatory mechanism of the antisocial personality is acting out. In other words, it's almost the polar opposite of what the obsessive-compulsive, often introvert, is. The entire structure of the antisocial personality is based around extroversion, and all the subtypes of antisocial personality disorder are based around dominance, aggression, and a voracious need for attention or reputation, as the named subtypes of antisocial personality disorder are nomadic, reputation defending, risk-taking, covetous, and malevolent. And the stranger's brains are wired very differently to that of the average person on the street. Lacking empathy, remorse, and an overall conscience, they are resistant to nerves, struggle with language and understanding both verbal and visual semantics, and they also struggle with non-verbal cues, and this is because their prefrontal cortex does not work like an average brain. In part 1 about the organised killer, I talked about how his prefrontal cortex would always be lighting up in regard to planning, risk assessment, decision making, and, once the act of slaughter is finished, ensuring that the organised killer had covered all the aces and bases and removed all forensic evidence. The prefrontal cortex, which is centred at the very front of our frontal lobes, makes us intelligent and, well, it also makes us human. It deals with stress control, executive functions, regulates behaviour, thoughts, and also emotions. Now, when it comes to psychopaths, look at this scan which shows the normal person and psychopath brain and how different parts come to life or don't come to life for each subject. The frontal lobe and amygdala, which is not part of the frontal lobe, the amygdala is based more in the limbic system at the back of the brain and deals with anxiety, fight or flight response, warning systems, and activation anxiety, all light up for the normal person, but not for the psychopath. Now, come back to the prefrontal cortex, and once again, the activity is either missing or at least greatly reduced. The organised killer Dollarhide used his prefrontal cortex And whilst he may have had some anxiety post-spree, nothing inhibited his brain function when it was time to clean up his scene. If he was feeling any anxiety, then his brain did a remarkable thing. It stayed focused whilst feeling that anxiety. However, with psychopathic offenders and our disorganised killing strangers, they would show a persistent pattern of reckless behaviour, and their pathophysiology is related to dysfunction in their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This basically means they have less common sense and are more prone to instant gratification without any consideration for the consequences. Now, although offenders such as the strangers are capable of executing well-planned crimes, they typically act impulsively and do not deliberate the consequences of their actions, neither for themselves nor for others, and this is why their sprees are so vicious, bloodthirsty, and they walk away without fear of consequences. They may drive around trying to find a stray Liv Tyler who is heading out to somewhere remote, and they may tease and have some fun by asking, "Is Tamara home?" and then knocking and running, but this is all just part of the fun. And when we come to the disorganised killer, despite sometimes the crime being impulsive and retaliatory, as who hasn't got into an argument upon finding out someone has cheated on you, lied to you, or just generally upset you, and the need to lash out sometimes can overwhelm people. So the strangers' murders are all expressive, excessive, and about living in the moment. The organised Dolarhyde might focus on the process and not the outcome, but for the disorganised killer, there is no process. There is only outcome. And the reason there is no process is because process only inhibits the outcome, and the strangers want an outcome now. Also, with a lack of prefrontal cortex action and an inhibited frontal lobe, their planning skills are also severely limited. They don't have the intrapsychic or biological mechanisms to deal with patience, to study something, delay their focus, or have an attention to detail. They just want to act and act out now. And whilst they can wait for the final stabby McStab blow to the gut or head, they want to cause as much chaos and suffering for the people who they are closing in on, so be it knock or run, asking, "Is Tamara home?" or driving a car so they run them off the road. There is zero process here. It's all about outcomes. It may well be the lack of intellect, as their frontal lobes are not lighting up as other people's do, but it's also just childlike excitement and eagerness to get their kicks from sadism or just being a general dick, because their entire interactions with the world is all about watching people get upset, trying to understand how the human condition works, and getting an adrenaline kick from being cruel. The organised killer might be recreating an abusive scene or marshalling a desire through the gears and motions of a personality which is adjusting and rising to their unfolding spree, but the disorganised killer just wants some fun now, and who cares about the planning? That part of their brain isn't working, so it's like me asking you how your second nose feels. You don't have a second nose, so the mere question seems silly and you can't understand what a second nose would feel like. And here, as the prefrontal cortexes aren't firing, there isn't any lucidity or insight into straightforward questions such as, why do you do this? What do you get from it? And how do you think the victim feels? It's not that the strangers don't care. They just have no comprehension of the matter. It's also important that the strangers don't stop for a snog or a shag between deaths, as this really isn't about a sexual thrill or a folio de boyfriend and girlfriend like Mickey and Mallory from Natural Born Killers. This is more congruent to their antisocial personalities of just being reckless, loving the thrill of being sadistic, and, on top of all of that, pushing themselves more and more into heedless one-downsmanship in terms of how low they can go each time. In Prey at Night, the strangers don't seek out Christina Hendricks' family, as the family comes to them, and so they are just there. And, as per psychopathy and the interpersonal and biological deficits of antisocial personality disorder, the Hendricks family are just objects of amusement where no amount of pleading or reasoning will work. Bailey Madison's character even pleads with them to leave them alone, but as Pinup pops up from the darkness, she merely states, "But we're just getting started." There isn't method here, just madness. Again, that's not to say the strangers are idiots with low intellect just because their prefrontal cortexes aren't firing. There is calculation. At one point, they break in and smash all the phones so the Hendricks family cannot call for help, and they do their best to isolate each member. And when a policeman does show up, there is no hesitation, and Dollface dispatches him without even a blink or a thought because, well, why not? And that's a risk and needs to be eliminated. So, yes, there's planning, but it's basic. Very, very basic. It's not meticulous like Dollarhide had. And speaking of why not, after killing the cop and further hacking at Bailey Madison, Dollface is shot, sorry, spoilers, and lies dying on the ground. And it's here where Bailey Madison asks the brilliant Emma Bellamy, who plays Dollface with such pure joy and malice, "Why are you doing this to us?" That Dollface just smiles despite bleeding to death and surely being in agonising pain and just states, "Why not?" whilst her victim looks puzzled. And it's that dyad of opposites which sums the strangers up. They don't understand social cues, they don't have empathy, and they disregard all common sense for heedless sadism and hedonism, but when their victim stands over them and tries to comprehend or deal with the trauma, the victim is left grasping at straws at why someone can just be so cruel. It's two vastly different brains grasping a situation and understanding or not understanding what's going on. Dollarhide's understanding of love and intimacy was meshed with violence right from his early childhood, and he was overcome with mental illness, but I don't think the strangers are mentally ill, just severely disordered people with brain deficits. The organised killer is about control, the disorganised killer is about impulse, and the two are vastly different regardless of any coexisting psychopathy between them. The prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe is crucial in responsibility. It stops you making a purchase on impulse or saying something at work which will get you fired. It keeps you considering all the variables, whether either budgeting or thinking about things in your job, and if we were to take that away, all you have left is the opposite, and all you can think about is instant gratification, lack of consequence, and zero remorse for anything. In Natural Born Killers, Mickey and Mallory may well be disorganised killers, but they're also very tactile and sexually expressive killers, and they like nothing more than a good screw or a snog during or after a murder. They may have poor impulses and get off on the risk-taking and adrenal surges, but for the strangers, they are oddly asexual and unbothered. There is never any affection between them, and they are like an emotionless autopsy worker chopping into bodies to see what's inside rather than having an intense kiss after slaughtering a screaming mother. An article from the Online Crime Museum said of disorganised serial killers that they usually have low IQs and are extremely antisocial. They rarely have close friends or family and do not like to stay in one place for too long. These killers are prone to have no recollection of their deeds or to confess that they were motivated by voices in their heads. Now, I'm not sure if the strangers have voices in their heads, as there's no evidence of this. They don't respond to any unseen stimuli like Dollarhide does, but we are on the continuum of psychopathy and personality because they are extroverts who are keen to take bigger and bigger risks and leave more and more gratuitous bloodbaths. They also leave a scene with sheer apathy more than anything else, as, with everyone dead, what's the point in sticking around? And as I love how the strangers walk away in the first movie as if they haven't done anything and then bump into the kids and take the leaflet off them, it just goes to show the sheer detail and focus of the writers who paint them as nomadic vagrants who are just off to find more objects to interfere with, and not a single toss is given about the corpses behind them or the blood at the walls in the house just about 10 feet away. Dollarhide killed families as they represented what he never had, a loving and caring unit which nurtured him, and he has a sexual predilection for the matriarchs of the families he kills and a desire for control and arranging a perfect scene that he then goes and cleans up. For the disorganised killer, however, they will create havoc, leave their weapons in the corpses, and the strangers target anyone who they can isolate because their only concern is about having a good time and frightening, threatening, torturing, killing, and then leaving. Their use of lipstick to write words on the windows is a childlike sign of delinquency which sits far from the methodical interpretation of the organised killer's crime. Also, disorganised killers have a tendency to depersonalise their victims by excessive facial mutilation, and in The Stranger's Prey at Night, when the elderly couple are found, This is indeed accurate, as they have ripped up the faces to what can only resemble a truly ghastly image. Now, going back to Dollarhide, he inserted mirrors into the eyes of his victims, but that was more so they could look alive while they were watching him. Their faces weren't cut up or mutilated, they just had glass in them so their eyes shone in the light. Anyway, that concludes our two-part gander at the organised and disorganised killer. I hope you enjoyed the two videos and maybe even had a chance to learn something. So, until next time, remember that psychology is cool. So please like, share and subscribe, or even leave a comment, as they always generate good debate or a suggestion for a future video. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
Why are you doing this? Why not?